Welcome to her remarkable history. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The Lost Tomb of Bloody Mary I. One of the most notorious monarchs in English history is Bloody Mary, or Mary I. She's remembered today for being the brutal daughter of Henry VIII, who would go on to burn over 280 religious heretics at the stake. Mary died childless, and her throne would then pass to her half-sister Elizabeth I, who couldn't have been more different to her. But following Mary's death, she was said to have wanted to have been buried with her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. But her greatest wish for her remains to lie with her mother inside of Peterborough Cathedral were never taken into consideration. Mary instead was buried inside of Westminster Abbey, but her tomb is one today which can literally be missed. And what is the story of the lost tomb of Mary I? During her life, Mary faced a number of difficulties in her kingdom. Following the death of her half-brother, Edward VI, Lady Jane Grey came onto the throne, and Mary then ousted the 9-day queen from power. She would then execute Jane and her husband, but the Catholic monarch then restored Catholicism as the country's religion. She began to punish and persecute Protestants across the lands, and along with many of her Catholic bishops, she began to sentence many religious reformers and heretics to death. In many English towns and cities, Protestants were being burned at the stake in horrific scenes, and many were burned together in large-scale executions. These killings solidified Mary's reputation for being a brutal ruler, and she continued to punish Protestants further, as she blamed them for the fact she could not have a child. She would die without an heir, and she at times treated her half-sister Elizabeth with contempt and suspicion. She even had the future final Tudor queen locked up inside the Tower of London, and the two had many differences, including religion, and a rivalry would form between the two. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was rather unpopular, especially as many feared the Spanish Catholics' influence. Mary I died on the 17th of November 1558 from possible uterine cancer or ovarian cysts or cancer at the age of 42. Her will said that the body of Catherine of Aragon was to be taken from Peterborough Cathedral to the Church of the Observant Friars in Greenwich following her death, and that the pair would be interred together in honourable tombs and monuments. But the rivalry that Elizabeth I and Mary I had throughout their lives and childhood would unite them following their deaths. Mary's body was embalmed and was wrapped in cerecloth after her heart and lungs were removed, and the cavity was packed with spices and herbs. It was then covered in purple velvet and was decorated with lace and gold gilt nails. It's believed that Mary's heart was placed in a silver casket lined with velvet and was buried in the Chapel Royal of St. James's. The funeral procession of Mary I was rather grand, and an observer said, "The corpse of the late Queen was brought from St. James's in a chariot with a painted effigy of her person, adorned with crimson velvet and a crown on her head, her sceptre on her hand and her many gold rings on her fingers. The coffin was accompanied by her household servants in black gowns, and by many others and members of her government. The chief mourner was Margaret Douglas, the Countess of Lennox, Mary's first cousin. The coffin passed by Charing Cross to Westminster Abbey, and was taken in the great door of the church. Gentlemen carried her coffin into the abbey from the chariot, and it was met by the bishops and the abbot of Westminster Abbey. She laid there all night and was watched over by 100 men in black gowns. Her regalia was offered to God, and her body was then buried in a vault in the north aisle of the chapel of Henry VII. Her ministers and staff broke their staves of office and threw them into the grave as their heralds proclaimed. The Queen is dead, long live the Queen, the Bishop of Winchester stated. She was a king's daughter, she was a king's sister, she was a king's wife, she was a queen, and by the same title a king also. But then Mary was buried inside of Westminster Abbey, which was completely against what she wanted. Today, inside of the Henry VII Lady Chapel in Westminster Abbey is a huge and ornate tomb that marks the burial spot of Queen Elizabeth I. This huge and great marble tomb was built on the orders of James I to honour the final Tudor monarch, and on top of the tomb is her effigy, and is just Elizabeth. The tomb shows how she would have looked in her old age, and on the side of the tomb are inscriptions telling her greatest achievements, claiming she was a settler of peace and the defeater of the Spanish Armada. There is no mention of her mother Anne Boleyn, and the incredible tomb also marks the burial place of her half-sister, Mary I. It is easy to miss that Bloody Mary is buried there, and it shows how at the time her reign was one which was deemed as forgettable or insignificant. There is Elizabeth, who is greatly celebrated, but Mary, who is forgotten. But Mary never wanted to be buried inside of a tomb marked by Elizabeth I, or in the same place. The Latin inscription on the monument states, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in hope of the resurrection." The tomb Mary I wanted was never built by Elizabeth, but Elizabeth also would not mark the burial site of her own mother during her reign. She did not even build a tomb for her father, or her half-brother Edward VI, and it was James I who made her tomb and commissioned it. Mary's grave was left unmarked for around 50 years after her death, and it was said that rubble from altars broken during the Reformation were piled on top of her burial site. But James I would be the one who paid for the tomb of Elizabeth I, and James had her buried on top of Mary. It was said that the long war of the English Reformation is closed. The sisters are at one. The daughter of Catherine of Aragon and the daughter of Anne Boleyn rest in peace at last. The two coffins were placed in the same vault. Elizabeth's coffin was placed on top of Mary's, showing for a final time that she was subordinate or below the position of her half-sister Elizabeth. During the search for James I's remains and body, it was said that the tomb of Elizabeth and Mary was opened. It was said the excavations, however, had almost laid bare the wall immediately at the eastern end of the monument of Elizabeth, and through a small aperture a view was obtained into the low, narrow vault immediately beneath her tomb. It was instantly evident that it enclosed two coffins, and two only, and could not be doubted that these contained Elizabeth and her sister Mary, the upper one larger and more distinctively shaped in the form of the body, like that one of Mary Queen of Scots, rested on the other. There was no disorder or decay, except the centering wood had fallen over the head of Elizabeth's coffin, and that the wood case had crumbled away at the sides, and had drawn away part vault of one decaying of the lid. No coffin plate could be discovered, but fortunately the dim light fell on a fragment of the lid slightly carved. This led to a further search, and the original inscription was discovered. There were two Tudor badges, a full double rose, deeply but simply incised in the outline of the middle of the cover, on each side the August initials ER, and below the memorial date 1603. The coffin lid had been further decorated with narrow moulded panelling. The coffin case was of inch elm, but the ornamental lid containing the inscription and panelling was of fine oak, half an inch thick, laid on the inner elm cover. The whole was covered with red silk velvet, of which much remained attached to the wood, and it had covered not only the sides and ends, but also the ornamented oak cover, as though the bare wood had not been thought rich enough without the velvet. The sight of this secluded a narrow tomb, thus compressing in the closest grasps the two Tudor sisters, partners of the same throne and grave, sleeping in the hope of resurrection. The solemn majesty of the great Queen thus reposing, as can hardly be doubted by her own desire, on her sister's coffin, was the more impressive from the contrast of its quiet calm with the confused and multitudinous decay of the Stuart vault, and of the fullness of its tragic interest, with the vacancy of the deserted spaces which had been hitherto explored in the other parts of the chapel. The vault was then immediately closed. So Mary I was buried inside of Westminster Abbey with her sister Elizabeth, and the tomb has little mention of the Catholic Tudor monarch. It celebrates her half-sister, but not her, and ultimately she is another Tudor monarch who rests in a place where she did not want to be buried. Her father, Henry VIII, was the same, as he wanted to be buried in an elaborate tomb that was never built or finished. But today Mary I's tomb is incredibly easy to miss inside of England's most beautiful and ornate religious building. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.